In this module of physical and cognitive development in adolescence, we will address the Piaget theory. According to Piaget's theory, a formal operational stage is what is typically seen among adolescents, and this begins around the age of 11 years of age. Uh, this is where we typically develop the capacity to process abstract and scientific thinking. However, it's important for us to know that it's not necessarily based on chronological age, but also on the experience. Hence, the importance of a solid foundation, education-wise, and also through outings with our parents. Our capacity to think as a scientist, to rule out things and to manipulate variables, typically improves with age. We find that older adolescents sometimes consider alternative reasons as to why something may occur. This is what's known as confounding variables. They don't only take what you've given them for a while, they begin to think on their own. Also, they come up with more general logic rules about through internal reflection, and this is something that again is enhanced or facilitated by their experiences. If they've lived, if they've experienced beyond that which is typically seen for their cohort, then they're likely to maybe come up with different ideas as they reflect and bounce off their own schemas and concepts and prototypes. Uh, the capacity for us to be able to experience without experiencing things is something that's unique about this. That is to say, experiencing without experiencing is that we may be able to feel or imagine what others may be feeling like without having to have experienced those. However, if we go through the experience ourselves, then it becomes part of our schema and it's easier for us as well. The exposure to more complex problems as we get older also kind of forces us to be expanding and developing cognitively. Oftentimes, these more complex problems that we face as we get older can bring about a dramatic view of who we are and what the world is, and even others. So, judgment is sometimes a sad part of this adolescence component. And it's not only judging others, but judging ourselves maybe harshly. The self concern is something that has been noted among them, and it's not unique to them, but it seems to be at its highest point among adolescents. So oftentimes it's encouraged that parents would empathize with the teen and assure them that it's not the end of the world as the teenager may be thinking, that others have gone through that. Needless to say, that is sometimes not sufficient. Oftentimes adolescents feel that nobody else has ever gone through that problem, that nobody has it as bad as them, and they cannot realize or see beyond the problem. They just focus on that, and if matched with depression and with low problem solving skills, this can result in bad outcomes. They're also very idealists. Idealism seems to characterize teenagers a lot, and this is where they build grand visions of what their life should be like and maybe what it will be like. And while that is definitely encouraged that they have goals, it is also important to help them see that they're filled and they're made up of flaws and virtues, and that whatever their goals may be require sacrifices and dedication. They're also very sensitive to criticism. They're not typically people who would accept criticism clearly or easily. So, just to make things easier, if they need to be corrected or criticized, it should be done with caution and typically in private. Addressing it in a public setting typically makes things worse because of the self concern. And also indecisiveness, which may not necessarily end with adolescence, but they're more likely to take more risks and focus on short term goals. And this may be the reason why sometimes adolescents may spend long hours at the mall only to walk away with one pair of jeans or two. And This is because of the indecisiveness. So parents, for the most part, are encouraged to not decide for the adolescent. Let the adolescent decide, and through their success or through their failure, it would be a lesson for them. The self-consciousness and self-focusing has led to two primary concepts that are discussed in this slide, and that's the imaginary audience and personal fable. The imaginary audience is where an adolescent believes that everyone's attention is he or she. And they become quite self-conscious about their appearance, about their makeup, about their wardrobe, and they may in fact go to great lengths to avoid embarrassment because they feel that it would be the worst thing if anybody would ever see them not at their prime. A personal fable is basically an inflated opinion of their own importance. They feel special, they feel unique. In fact, part of the reason as to why we have high sexually transmitted infections among teenagers and high automobile accidents and deaths is because despite all the propaganda that tell them that it's dangerous, they often believe that it will strike everybody else but them. So it often leads to sensation-seeking thrills that can result in bad outcomes. It's interesting to note that there have been several studies that have supported these gender differences in mental abilities. And what they find is that girls, for the most part, are superior in scores with reading, writing throughout the entire school years. And this biologically has been explained as a possible hypothesis and supported that when we are in our mother's womb, that is prenatally, our left hemisphere in the cerebral cortex is actually developing earlier, and the left hemisphere is actually the one that's responsible for language. So because of this earlier exposure to development, their hypothesis is that girls would receive greater verbal stimulation and abilities, and not to mention that society would also encourage that. In fact, though this practice is now archaic, but not that long ago, relatively, high school girls and middle school girls used to write letters to one another. And it was a practice that was more common among girls than it is among guys. Also, cards, birthday cards, or just for any occasion, they're more likely to be used and sent by girls, by females, than by guys. So this is something that society, in some way, they say has encouraged, and some people argue that we were innately predisposed to excel in this. Boys, on the other hand, seem to excel in mathematics and science, but this is not true throughout the entire life or school years. This is actually seen in early adolescence. Prior to that, girls and boys either score equally or just fluctuate, give and take among one another. Now, this is something that is worthy of noting and mentioning, that if it's only that in early adolescence boys seem to excel in mathematics more so than girls, then it leads to questioning whether this is a byproduct of our biology or if it's because it's encouraged more so in our society. The biological explanation says that we, in our mother's womb, have earlier exposure to androgen hormones, which would enhance the right hemispheric function of our cerebral cortex. And this is where we are able to manipulate shapes in space and three dimension and also mathematical skills. However, the social view says that math and science have been viewed for a long time as masculine, and that a guy who would be good at writing and reading would be considered to be more feminine, and that is not something that's been encouraged in heterosexist societies. During adolescence, we also see that we are capable of mastering irony and sarcasm, and it's often encouraged that prior to this age, it not be used because it could confuse the child as their cognitive abilities would not allow them to do so. Uh, in adolescence, we may be able to perceive it, especially when there's some type of exaggerating or mocking tone. But as we get older, we wouldn't necessarily need all these cues for us to be able to perceive and comprehend. Figurative language also improves greatly in adolescence. For example, his bark is worse than his bite. Um, Someone younger than 13 would probably struggle to. But again, that depends a lot on experience, not just the age alone. This is something that is enhanced with reading proficiency, so the more they read, the easier they're able to understand figurative language. And then writing and grammar, about 25% of the United States is proficient. This is a problem, and we find that maybe the answer could be in the fact that in the United States we use traditional instruction for grammar, and that is to say maybe even standards or lectures, whereas in other places like Finland, Netherlands, Japan, and various other countries that seem to be ahead of us, they improve or they teach grammar with meaningful purposes. That is, they may assign a project at the beginning of the semester, have a child go uh, do some volunteer hours or be involved, submerged in the culture of an orphanage or an elderly retirement home. And based on their observations, they ought to write. And in that writing and their investigation, they ought to read and they ought to form reports that have to include all these grammatical rules. And when they make it meaningful that way, when it's something the student cares about, there seems to be a greater comprehension and application of these rules. It's not unusual to see teenagers have the TV, the iPad, the iPod, the iPhone, and their book on the side while doing homework. And this is something that is not necessarily recommended. We find that this, of course, splits their attention, and their learning is not necessarily at the highest or deepest level. TV and computer in the bedroom are often strongly linked to multitasking, so it's recommended that there be some type of break from technology, some type of detox from technology, if you will, as again, it fragments their attention span and also inhibits the activation of the hippocampus, which you may remember from previous slides is essential for memory consolidation. As we look at vocational development and what adolescents may choose to be when they grow older and they choose a career, we find that this is key to development of solid and secure identity. We do go through the process according to Erickson of identity versus role confusion. So we may start off with a desire for something and then change our mind as we get older and reality becomes more real for us. And this is something that we begin to think about before adolescence and will extend into our mid 20s, and sometimes we see even past that. The selection of a vocation typically goes through three processes: the fantasy period, and this is where we are guided by familiarity, glamour, excitement. So maybe at some point, a lot of boys wanted to be an astronaut, or maybe an actor, or a model among males and females. And this is something that's typically seen in early and middle childhood. As we get older, between ages 11 and 16, we reach a tentative period, and this is where we are guided by interest, our abilities, our values. So if I'm good at math, then maybe I would tie that to an engineering or an architecture career. If I'm good at reading and debating and I like that, then maybe I'd consider being an attorney. If I like helping others, then social work. And then as we get into late teens and early 20s, we hit the realistic period, and this is often guided by economical and practical realities of adulthood. And sadly, if we do not have socioeconomic status that would support those dreams, we would have to then conform to something else. So let's say that there's a young girl who wanted to be a doctor. At the tentative period, she realizes that she is good at biology, she is good at critical thinking, but sadly, at the age of 17, she got pregnant. And now she realizes that there needs to be some type of practical career that could help her earn money fast, and maybe she would settle for something of a trade career, maybe in the medical field, but staying away maybe from the MD. And this is something that we see in late teens and early 20s. Personality and vocational choice is essential as well. We find that there's 6 personality types, and some of these are pretty self-explanatory, so we won't go in depth on these in here. And you have investigative, the social, the realistic, the artistic, and conventional, and enterprise. And we find that really every career choice we make reflects a little bit of what we may desire or lack. There's this interesting case of an artistic person who was really gifted at working with figures, and there was this penny in the 1960s that was an error. It was printed with an error, and you may know that sometimes when the mint department prints something that is not supposed to be printed, instead of actually being worth nothing, they may rise in value. And in this particular case, this penny was worth, at the time, I think about $5. So this artist, who was good at sculpturing things, decided to redo those pennies. And now the mint department knew how many pennies were in circulation, and when they found that there were many more in circulation, they realized that it was a counterfeit penny. Now this was a perfect thing to do, because rarely ever do people counterfeit or spend time with pennies. It's usually large bills. Well, this guy did such an amazing job that he almost got away with it. And this is something that was in this show. He almost got away with it, and I think it's called Criminal Court TV or something. Now, this guy was so proud of his project and his work that he could not help but put his initials in there. Very, very, very small. And had it not been for those initials in there, they would have never been able to trace the counterfeit pennies. And it was, in fact, his personality, which somehow, among artistic people, not all, but there's a desire to be looked at, the desire to be recognized, the desire to be admired. And that may very well lead you into a career. Ultimately, we find that the family does have a tremendous influence on what the child will do. A young person's aspirations strongly correlate with their parents' jobs, and this is something that we'd like to maybe do away or with, not completely, but to give those who are in lower socioeconomic status an opportunity to also dream up and think and aspire to other jobs. The choices are consistent with the socioeconomic status, as higher socioeconomic status typically promotes curiosity and self-direction, whereas lower socioeconomic status often promote conformity and obedience. Work-study programs are needed, and these are seen worldwide, in which the teenager gets a chance to improve their achievement and reduce delinquency, as they are now more driven and focused on that career choice.